Hello, I'm really excited to be joined today by one of the brightest and really most accomplished minds in sustainable marketing, Michelle Carvill. Michelle has probably too many career accolades to list them all, but I'll start with some of the most recent things she's been doing, including co-hosting the podcast Can Marketing Save the Planet? She's also a sustainable marketing consultant, and she's about to publish her sixth book. And she's also in the process of organizing the first conference of marketers to bring together marketers to talk about sustainability. So many accolades. We're so excited to talk to her. So welcome, Michelle Carvill.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, but I first want to talk about your first sustainable book, Sustainable Marketing: How to Drive Profits with Purpose. It touches on like a common myth with I think sustainable products in general, that they cost too much and aren't ultimately good for business. So can you share some of the like key findings you've learned in writing that book about how brands can both be purposeful and profitable?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to give a bit of context as to why that book came about, just briefly, is that myself and my now business partner, Gemma Butler, and another colleague of ours, as experienced marketers, were aware that as marketers, and we've worked product side, client side, agency side, all over the place, we weren't really thinking about the impact or indeed the purpose or indeed sustainability, responsibility aspects of marketing. And so that led us to think about the role marketing played, because the narrative was changing. We were all becoming more concerned around the climate crisis and the impact of irresponsible consumption. And of course, marketing is that kind of consumption engine, and we were well aware of that. So when we started to dive into the research and looking at what does driving profits with purpose look like, what do brands that are doing well, what does good business drive for businesses, it was really heartening to see that good business is really good for business. And that's because of a number of reasons for brands and organizations. And one of them, and it's almost like that perfect storm of various different stakeholder viewpoints shifting and changing, and the landscape changing. And those organizations that kind of are pace setting and understand those shifts and changes, like any good business that is keeping a pace with the changing needs and hearts and minds of desires of the landscape that it operates in, is going to have that advantage. And that's what we saw. These brands, these organizations that got it, that understood it, weren't just all around the social impact side of things. It was also a case of, this is good for business. This makes commercial sense. And it makes commercial sense for a number of reasons. One is it drives efficiencies within organizations. And I think, how often do businesses kind of navel gaze, and organizations, to the extent that they are thinking, is this the most sustainable? And I don't just mean environmentally sustainable. I mean, is this the most efficient, the most sustainable way that we can be doing things? And sustainability, really, if you're going to focus in that area, it drives that lens and attention inwards to actually have to look at your operations, look at how you're developing your products, how you're sourcing those products, at all those levels. And of course, from the organizations that I've worked with, that's often what is driving some significant efficiencies. They start looking inwards and they think, actually, we can reduce the packaging, we can eradicate plastics, we can. So it's actually cost savings as well as making sustainable improvements. So it drives those efficiencies. It meets the hearts and minds of the talent that want to work for you. It also touches the hearts and minds of those people that already work with you. So there are some big productivity statistics out there about most people are not delighted or thrilled with the work that they do. They don't feel that they're engaged. They don't feel that they're heard. They don't feel that they jump out of bed every day with a purpose. So, of course, if organizations and brands can actually engage their employees and future employees with regards to, you are doing some great by working with us, then productivity increases. So again, there's more efficiency within the business, because people who work with sustainable businesses that are purpose-led, they get joy out of that, and therefore they enjoy their work. It's more, they're enjoying what they're doing, and productivity increases. And when we talk about productivity, we might just think, oh, that's a nice thing to have. But for businesses, the recent Gallup poll showcases that between it costs, that disconnection, that kind of loss of productivity, costs organizations between 400 and $500 billion a year. So even if you kind of do your sustainability and become purpose-led just so you're engaging your employees and driving productivity, there are enormous cost savings to be had. And then when we're thinking about future forward and we're thinking about outward facing and the demand side and our customers, then of course we understand that that landscape is changing. Increasingly, there have been reports coming out over the last few years talking about how consumers are increasingly wanting to make more sustainable choices. They want to be part of a solution. They often don't know what to do or what to buy, so they're looking at brands and organizations to steer them in that direction. But the sentiment is actually there. And we recently on our podcast interviewed Sandy Skis, who is the global lead of sustainability and impact at Porter Novelli. And she was saying that the Porter Novelli have been tracking customer behavior, consumer behavior for 20 years. And over the last couple of years, so they've seen a real shift around people making very evident cases for saying, we actually now want to change how we eat, how we use our energy, how we travel, because we know that we have an important role to play. So it isn't just about what they consume, it's actually about how they're changing their behaviors of how they live. So those organizations that kind of stay apace with what's happening and what's coming, of course, are able to innovate, of course, are able to meet the needs of those audiences, rather than just try and think about that kind of fixed mindset of, well, this is our product, this is our service, this is what we're going to do, and we're maybe going to make it a bit greener, to actually looking at the opportunity of, wow, people's hearts and minds and thoughts and views and behaviors are, there's an appetite here for doing this. How do we meet those audiences where they are at? And I think that those organizations that get that they understand the emotional, they understand that connection to helping bring their audiences with them on the journey, so that the audiences feel that they're part of this, that they're contributing, that they're similarly with their employees, we're part of this, we're contributing, we're making a difference. They're the ones that are kind of winning out.
I think that a lot of marketers, no matter what side you're on, can also find it overwhelming to improve the sustainability of an existing company. But I think that's why I found your new book so helpful as just like a resource. There's so many different topics that are touched about. If you have any questions about any specific things, sustainability, it seems like it's answered in this book with like great links to different resources as well. But can you explain, like, what was your ultimate goal of this book, and who would find this most useful?
Yeah. So when we wrote the first book, it was really a bit of a kind of research project for ourselves. It was, oh my goodness, we're marketers. We had no idea we were this much of a part of the problem, and no idea about the amount of opportunity about becoming part of the solution. And that means that marketers have to get back to strategy, good communication, really thinking about right audience, right message, right time. So it was kind of coming back to the basics and good old marketing principles. Over the past, I mean, we started writing and researching that first book back in 2018. It was published in 2021. And since that time, we started with the podcast, Gemma and I. We decided, we got to keep this conversation going, because there are 10.6 million marketers on the planet, it's estimated. And like us, they probably don't understand much about what we didn't understand before we started writing and researching. And it starts with education and awareness. And somebody has got to start thinking about how we re-educate and rethink and reshape the way that marketers behave and what we do and what we're responsible for. And so from the first book through to the podcast, we kept that conversation going in and immersing ourselves in organizations, finding out what they were doing, speaking to marketing teams, understanding the real lived experience challenges as to what were going on. At the same time, we were designing solutions to kind of support marketers to say, look, from an education and awareness perspective, this isn't in your normal training curriculum. So now we need to rethink and retrain and get back to the education. So we developed courses around carbon literacy for marketers, the sustainable marketer, what that means to be a marketer in 2023, 2024. Putting together your sustainable marketing strategy, all the different things that you need to think about, greenwashing and everything that you need to be aware of, and all the different regulations and guidelines. And Do you understand what the Paris Agreement is? Do you understand what your scope 1 and 2 and 3s are? Do you understand even what's going into the sustainability report? So we immersed ourselves in that space and then started to build this resource of education and awareness, working with marketing institutions in the UK and in the US, working with various business schools and academics and educators around, we need to change how marketing is. Marketers need to be qualified in this subject, because we shouldn't just be going and doing what we do without really understanding the landscape. And so over the past few years, that's what we've been doing. We've been developing training resources, education resources, support resources, consulting, working internally with organizations, helping them with their strategy, their communication strategies. That's where this came from. You know, it was a case of, we can't get to the 10.6 million marketers around the world, but now understand there is I need to do something, but what do I do? How do I do it? And so this is why this is 101 practical ways to use sustainable marketing as a force for good. You know, this book could have been 10 times fatter, but we had to kind of say a lot in a short, succinct time, because we also want to get to the solutions. And so that's what we've delivered.
Yeah, and I think you did an amazing job with that, boiling down a lot of what can be complicated topics into bite-sized ways of being able to digest it. You mentioned a few times in there just like how brands are even communicating those sustainability efforts, which I think is like also a huge piece of brands trying to figure out and learning how they think about the communicating the sustainability of their products, their messaging, their efforts. So I guess from what you've learned, is it better to lead with sustainability, like especially from like a product benefits standpoint, or are consumers more likely to purchase a good that happens to also be sustainable? Share what you've learned about that topic.
This is where there is this challenge between, should brands be waiting for the consumer to dictate whether their products should be more sustainable? You know, because there is this idea of, you know, well, the consumer isn't asking for it to be greener or this, so therefore we're not going to do anything. And for me, that's kind of offsetting your responsibility of doing what the good business and what should be done, waiting for the consumer to dictate what it is that you do. Or should you just be selling well regardless? So it's, you know, what you shouldn't be doing is trying to campaign your way with sustainability. We interviewed Cecilia Parker Arana, who is the Director of Consumer Protection at the Competitions and Markets Authority in the UK, who they have set the Green Claims Code, the regulation around the claims that can be made. Over similarly to the FTC over in the US, similar to the EU Green Deal, you know, there are regulations around greenwashing, what can be said, what can't be said. And one of the things she said that was really clear is that sustainability should be something you do. It shouldn't be something that you campaign around. And I think that if you're just developing products so that they're sustainable, then effectively you're not just doing what you do and saying what you do and selling what it is that you do. You're actually designing a product so that it can be campaigned as sustainable, rather than just, actually, this is the right thing to do. We're now switching that soap out and it's going to be the most sustainable way we can do it. We don't really need to talk about the sustainability bits because it's just the soap. Instead of that new product coming in, we're just going to make sure that it smells great, looks great, does the right job. But the fact that it's 100% biodegradable and all the rest of it, we don't need to lead with that. It's just what we do. And if you think about social impact businesses, many of which we've interviewed a number on our podcast, a few of them we mention in the book. It's interesting when you speak to those guys because they don't actually see what they're doing as marketing. They're just talking about what it is that they do. And so I think there are these two different ways. Now, I think that there are a lot of organizations that aren't social impact businesses that haven't started off with purpose at the heart of what they're doing. So actually talking about what you're doing and the transitioning that you're doing and the changes that you're making and the commitments that you're doing to move towards something more sustainable, that transparency, that openness, I think is where the narrative can go for those. But I do think because of the green claims codes, it has, and various other green regulation, it is making organizations have to think about, we can't just talk about that, we've actually got to be doing it.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I think you mentioned some of the regulations that are helping to kind of push some of those things.
Yeah.
In the book, you talked about the Green Deal, which the European Commission is working to try to make sustainable products the norm instead of the exception. Can you explain a little bit about how they're aiming to do that, and what's it going to take for us in the US to do something similar?
I think it's going to take all of us. For one thing, they've created a law. There's legal requirements around what can and can't be done. So organizations are having to make sure that they are abiding to those challenges and rethinking their operations and the way they do things. They've set very clear lines of what is and what isn't permissible. There is this central commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050. And rather than just saying, okay, there's this central commitment, they're actually saying, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it means for industry, and this is what it means for your specific industry. It creates clarity. It gives organizations some steer. So, I'm not the biggest fan of policy dictating everything, but they're making it quite rigid, and they're giving very clear steer so that actually what does come onto the market fits within the parameters of what is acceptable, and therefore makes it normal. It's not just going to happen overnight, but they have very clear plans and processes in place and accountability. It's where the whole policy has come together, a little bit like the Paris Agreement, where it's a legally binding treaty that the majority of the global economy is legally bound to meet the needs of the Paris Agreement, which is around meeting net zero by 2050. The EU have kind of said, right, okay, well, what does that mean for marketers? If your organization has set decarbonization target, what does that mean for you? How are you reducing or aligning with those targets? It's the same, really, that the Green Deal is doing with regards to the Paris Agreement.
You also mentioned a stat in the book that we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by even 5% pretty quickly by just simple lifestyle changes, eating less meat, using less energy, finding alternative means for travel. And you mentioned how those types of changes can happen through marketing and storytelling. Can you give some examples of how marketers are using that kind of power of storytelling to encourage this type of lifestyle changes, and that may or may not be completely related to their products?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great example in the book, which is, we know that telling people not to do something is not necessarily the most effective way of changing behavior. So it's about understanding and meeting people where they are at. And marketers are really well positioned to understand what matters to people, finding that point of connection and influence people to do what we want them to do in a different way. And if you think about it, we influence people to do things all the time. So how do we influence them to make better choices? I think for marketers, there is this enormous opportunity to be remembering what it is that we're about, that we're not just about making sure we can get stuff into the hands and eyeballs of as many millions of people as possible to try and sell more stuff that people don't need, but actually to use our skills, creativity, and influence as a force for good. And I think that is a really exciting, interesting, and creative challenge.
I want to zoom in a little bit more on the digital marketing space. We've talked more broadly about marketing. What do you see as some of the biggest priorities that you see the digital industry needs to tackle to improve our sustainability?
I think I'm going to start with education and awareness, with marketers diving into what they do, and we're looking at the impact of marketing activities. The majority of marketers say, I had no idea the emails have an impact. And it's like, an email might have a really tiny carbon impact on its own, but times that by the hundreds of thousands and the millions, if not billions, of emails that are being sent, and the amount of waste that creates, because most emails aren't read, most are put into spam filters or boxes. And as marketers, we'd be very happy if we got a 5% click-through rate, whereas 95% may not even have been actioned or seen. Similarly with social media, video on social media is much higher carbon impact. So more people spending more time on TikTok or YouTube. And again, in isolation, these things aren't necessarily that big an impact. But when you actually think about how long people are using social media and the impact and the amount that we are encouraging people to stay on social media or buy things on social media, we're actually a significant part of the challenge, and the digital impact and footprint is quite significant. I mean, just before we started recording, we were just talking about the different statistics. It's estimated that the digital impact is bigger than the aviation impact. And I can understand that very clearly. Why? Because when you start to look at the impact of emails and social and websites, I mean, 576,000 websites are created every day. Only 15% of them are live. And if you think about your own activity and the amount of landing pages that are still hanging around and dead sites and dead pages, again, going back to those efficiencies, we're not, as marketers, even thinking about our impacts of what we do in our work. So I would say first thing is to really educate yourself about the amount of impact. And there are loads of calculators. There's lots of stuff that you can be doing to understand. We put a whole list of them in the book. And it just means that we have to now start thinking about, there are other solutions. There are other ways that we can do things. There are other platforms that are now dedicated and really focused on driving a more sustainable future. And so as marketers, the first thing is to really understand, because I think once you're educated and aware, then it starts to question everything that you do.
So you're really a resource of so much information about just sustainability and marketing, and have a lot of different advice on how anyone can move forward. But what type of advice would you give to any marketer within any organization trying to improve the sustainability of their company and don't even know where to start?
So we have a model. We call it inwards, upwards, outwards. And we call it our Sustainable Marketer Action Plan. And so the first thing to do is to educate yourself. Understand the landscape that you're operating in, because as a marketer, it is incumbent on us all to understand the landscape that we're operating in, because not only are we kind of custodians of the brand and the products and the services that we're marketing, and we have to understand what's going on the inside of the organization, we are also that interface between the inside and the outside of the organization. So on the outside, it's up to us as marketers to be custodians of customer, understanding the hearts and minds, the needs, the sentiment, the changes that are happening out in that landscape. Also, what's happening with our competitors, what's happening with innovations that could potentially be brought into the business. So we have to be looking inwards and understanding very deeply about what it is that we do so that we can best communicate that. But we also have to be looking outwards so that we can understand with our eyes and ears what's going on and bring that intelligence back in to the business. So the first thing, therefore, is understand what's going on in your landscape, because your landscape has shifted. There are things like the Paris Agreement. There are things like life cycle assessments that marketers will not be trained on. We do, but we do now need to understand where things are sourced from, what the distribution process is, what the manufacturing process is, if that's relevant. What is it? What does it look like? What does it mean? Who's leading it? Are you even involved in it? Who is involved in it? Go and speak to them. Marketers are very comfortable working across the value chain of the organization. So find out about what's going on with sustainability. And then the middle bit is the upwards piece. So it may be that your sustainability agenda is being led from the top. It's right up there on the top of the boardroom agenda now, and increasingly it is. And therefore, there is this wonderful cascading through the organization. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe that organization isn't being as pace setting as it needs to be around its sustainability agenda. So for you, it's a case of, as the eyes and ears, both internally and externally, it's a case of, are you aware of this? Do you know what our competitors are doing in this space? Are we even thinking about this? And then the third piece is outwards. So once you understand what's going on, once you understand the position and the strategy and where it sits on the board, what does that mean in how you now communicate? What do you say? How do you say it? This is, how do you keep that narrative moving transparently, authentically, honestly no greenwashing. How are you aligning with the regulation? So the inwards, upwards, outwards model is a model that we say to marketers: start with yourself, get educated first, figure out what's going on in the business, and then figure out what you're currently saying. There will be plenty in there for marketers to get to grips with. But education and awareness. Get curious. Really understand this space.
I think another great place to start is like reading and educating yourself. And I think your book,
Yes, thank you.
Say the Planet, is a great way to do that, and the podcast of the
The
same
podcast
name.
is
It's
great.
also a
Yeah.
great place to like learn from
Yeah.
others and what's been working. I really wanted to thank you for joining us today and sharing this knowledge. I think education is how we move all these industries forward.
It
So
is.
thanks for all your input, your insights, and everything you've written for our industry. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. And if you need any more support, we have lots of free resources on our Can Marketing Save the Planet.com site. So you'll find our podcast there. It's on all the other podcast platforms, but you'll find it there. We also have a learning zone. So anything that we think is useful for marketers, we put into the learning zone. And we've even gamified our learning zone. So we have like a 100 points challenge. And many organizations actually are setting that as their kind of baseline benchmark for education and awareness. So we get loads of emails from